How many of you have seen this image? It's a really popular image. You can Google it, and in it is both an older and a younger woman. Who knows, maybe there's even a third image that we could find in here. So how many of you, when you look at this, kind of quickly see the older woman? I do. When I immediately zoom in, that's what I see naturally. How many of you naturally see the younger woman? And then how many of you can kind of see both women in this image? Well, it took me forever on this image. Again, just by nature, when I zoom in, I see the older woman and I wanted to see the younger woman. So I was tilting my head, steering and focusing on it. And finally, I was able to see both. And that's kind of what we talk about when we hear about this term multivocal leadership. It's this concept that we have to, as leaders, be able to understand and see and adapt to the multiple views and needs around us. But what's more interesting to me about this image is it's not the image itself, but the study behind it. And so when they introduced this image, they had two groups of people split apart. Half of the group got the sketch on the left, half of the group got the sketch on the right. They had access to that sketch for 10 seconds, and then they went and they saw the image in the center. Now, what do you think? The image on the left, this sketch here, you can see my mouse. If you looked at this for 10 seconds, what do you think you see when you look in the middle? Older or younger woman? Typically older, right? So what about over here? You have access to this image for 10 seconds, and then you go look at the image in the center, and what do you think you see? Typically the younger woman, right? So when you think about it, that's called priming. 10 seconds of priming impacted how group after group saw the image in the middle. Imagine how a lifetime of priming impacts how we begin to see the world. And we've got to be aware of that because sometimes we could both be in the same situation. Have you ever actually been in the same meeting with someone and you walk away like, wow, that was the best meeting I've ever been to? And the other person was like, oh, that was horrible. So we can be in the same room, the same experience, and have two different takeaways depending on that filter. Sometimes we can both be right, right? So is this a 6? For sure. Is it a 9? Yes. A lot of it just depends on where you're standing and where you're coming from. So after we pause and we check our filter, the next step is to perspective take. And this means we're going to step back and try to see this number from different angles. And so when we perspective take, it's kind of like, we've heard a lot about try to walk in someone else's shoes. And I love that concept. It's very hard to do. It actually requires great amount of imagination. And a lot of the workshops that I do with clients, we actually do impromptu exercises. So we'll have a young woman in the group tell us what it was like to be the first man on the moon. So she's having to think outside of her experience and quickly go into character and explain what it was like to be there and to say those famous words that have gone down in history. One small step. And so things like that can simulations of seeing what it may be like to grow up in this time period with access to or lack of access to these resources in this setting. So it requires great imagination, and we need to bring imagination back. Another great way to perspective take is just baking into our model, asking before assuming, taking time to listen. And as we listen, we want to be active listeners. We want to not be thinking about the next question or our to-do list. We want to be present as we listen. Repeat back what the person said. Can you help me understand? Show them with your nonverbals that you are 100% with them. And also be empathetic. And being empathetic and compassionate as people share their stories. Another thing that often comes up as we perspective take, or when we take that step back to consider alternative views of the same situation, is that we've got to be aware of what's called the vicious and the virtuous cycle. So what this means is our thoughts impact our feelings, and our feelings impact our behaviors. So my friends, if our thoughts are negative about another person, or a group. And by the way, what the research shows is if we see one person negatively, we often see their entire group negatively. So when we have that negative thought, we're going to feel negative about the person. So you better believe we're going to behave negatively towards them. So if I am in an office and I'm feeling kind of negative about someone, they are going to quickly pick up on those vibes that I'm putting out. And what do you think they're going to do? They're going to put up a wall because their defenses are going to go up. You see, our brains are wired 5 times more for negative thoughts and negativity than positivity. So we have to be very intentional about directing our thoughts down positive paths. And when we do that, our behaviors are going to follow. Because what happens when the other person's wall comes up, then they begin to reinforce the very things that we were thinking negatively about them. So then we start thinking and behaving, and they start thinking and behaving. And this is called a negative cycle. This impacts marriages, relationships, all kinds of things. So to get out of this negative cycle, it takes one person seeing the other person in a positive light. Oh my goodness, can you imagine if we all just gave each other the benefit of the doubt? If we all just said, oh gosh, maybe they're just having a rough day. So I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, and then you're going to think positively about them, and you're going to behave in that way. By doing this positive cycle, you're going to begin to disarm them. And people typically do what? Unless you're dealing with a narcissist or a sociopath, which is a different workshop, people typically respond because they see you are going out of your natural form to meet them where they are. So I've got to ask, is there anyone that you need to see in a more positive light? And what would happen if you do? And what would be the impact if we collectively began to see others in a more positive light? Now, when we perspective take, another wonderful tool to do this is to story share. Now, did you know that story sharing actually unites the brains between the storyteller and the listener, making it one of the most long-standing and pure forms of communication? So it's one of the best tools to bridge any type of difference. So think about how creatively you could do this. I love StoryCorps, the Great Listen campaign. They've done all kinds of things where they set up listening stations across the country. They've done a Great Thanksgiving Listen. I know Chattanooga has done some wonderful things like this. You literally set up a booth and you go in and listen. Could be with a family member, could be with a total stranger. But the point is, you are actually just taking time to listen to someone's story. Oh my goodness. When we listen, we begin to understand, I get why they may be coming at it from this angle. And it produces great empathy and understanding and bridge building. So could you just do a listening campaign at your company or in your community? I think it's also a good exercise in our society to learn to be listeners. It requires great discipline, but in every listening campaign I've seen or be a part of, so many stories are uncovered that people haven't heard before, that people can relate to or learn from. You can think about the Humans of New York, just pictures and stories. It's a beautiful way to do it. Looking in your community between the elders and the youth, are we sharing what we've learned, and are we putting intentionality around that? I love an activity Soul Pancake did. They just put up this big ball stand with all kinds of balls in it, and each ball had a question. They plopped 2 strangers down in the ball bin, and they just talked to one another. That's it. One ball, pick it up, what's the question, and share back and forth. So I would encourage you, with all that we're talking about today, to be creative with it and have fun.